It's the Growing for Market podcast.
A basic soil test cost you in New York State is still actually less than $20. We'll call it $20. And you look at the revenue potential out of, say, a standard 3,000 square foot growing space, that the revenue potential there can be five figures. It's worth the $20 to know what you need to do. And I see soil tests that have 2 pounds of phosphorus per acre, and I see soil tests that have 600 pounds of phosphorus per acre. So the difference between those two values is enormous.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing flowers and vegetables for local markets. I'm Andrew Mefford, your host and the editor of Growing for Market magazine, proudly celebrating 35 years in 2026 as the magazine by and for vegetable and flower market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. And now, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. Seven Springs Farm Supply is a farm-based supply company focused on serving market gardeners and has been in business for 35 years. Their catalog includes a comprehensive selection of approved for organic fertilizers, pest and disease controls, growing mixes, cover crop seed, and more. They offer custom fertilizer blending and seasonal cooperative purchasing opportunities, and their experienced team is ready to help guide you to the best solution for your farm's needs. Growing for Market listeners are eligible for an exclusive discount. Visit sevenspringsfarm.com/GFM or give them a call at 540-651-3228. That's sevenspringsfarm.com/GFM for an exclusive discount.
Hey, it's Lindsay from Grown By. There are a lot of farm sales platforms out there, but there's only one that's cooperatively owned by farmers. And that's Grown By, your all-in-one solution to simplify farm sales. I'm proud and excited to share 2 new features now available on top of the tools you already know and love. Number 1, our customizable CSA box builder. It allows your customers to simply say what they'd like in their share, and Grown By matches their preferences with your weekly harvest. Number 2, our new wholesale-only marketplace. Developed with the Culinary Institute of America, it makes your life easier with a dedicated shop for your wholesale customers. No more texting those chefs. Combining retail and wholesale inventories and records. And, drumroll, automatic payments on due dates. No more chasing down late payments. These new features sit alongside our popular online sales and traditional subscription CSA tools, making it easier than ever to manage your farm's business. As you start to get ready for next season, we'd love to hear from you and see if our cooperative can be a partner in growing your farm. Visit us at grownby.com. That's GROWNBY.com.
Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Judson Reid to the Growing for Market podcast. Judson is a researcher and educator with the Cornell University Vegetable Program and has helped make a lot of great resources for growers over the years. On the one hand, he's one of the authors of a Cornell publication called the High Tunnel Best Management Practices Long-Term Soil Health and Fertility Guide. And on the other hand, he's also the author of 10 Reasons Not to Grow in High Tunnels. So we're going to talk about ideas from both of those publications today, and they're linked in the show notes if you want to read them yourself. So without further ado, welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, Judson.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, good. We're really happy to have you because I know we've worked on one or two things over the years, and you've put out a lot of really helpful materials for growers. And so I did want to talk about greenhouse fertility today just because I think most people know that if you're growing a long season crop like tomatoes or cucumbers or something like that, you can't put all the fertility up front. But then the question becomes okay, how to do that supplemental fertility. And also, I was just interested in the guide that you put out about high tunnel soil health and fertility, because I feel like, soil is finally getting the attention that it deserves. And I know that there's some differences between managing field soil and high tunnel soil. So I felt like it was a very timely conversation to have. But First of all, can you tell us how you got interested in agriculture, what you do for Cornell, and how long you've been doing that for?
Oh, sure. How I got interested in agriculture. I was raised in an agricultural environment in the northern part of New York State. My family had livestock. We had beef cattle and dairy cattle. So that was my initial exposure to agriculture, was a family farm environment. And I was fortunate I didn't know that I always wanted to be involved in agriculture, particularly as a young person. I wanted to travel. I wanted to experience other cultures. I did those things. And through that process, I realized I'm most comfortable in the out of doors, and to have a career where you're outside on a regular basis, agriculture is a great option. And then particularly in agriculture, you get to explore a lot of interesting questions around soil science, animal science, et cetera. And you get to do it with a lot of great hardworking people. So I found it to be very rewarding work. Went to school for agriculture at Cornell University and have had a career over the last couple decades that became more and more specialized in looking at the production of food crops in high tunnels or greenhouses, particularly when they're soil-based, and exploring how can we best manage that soil for long-term sustainability or viability in those settings.
Yeah, well, very cool. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing about agriculture. I feel like it's endlessly interesting because things are always changing, whether it be the weather, the pests, the crops that people are growing,
Yeah.
like where they're growing them in high tunnels and all that kind of stuff. So I can see how that keeps it interesting, and I'm glad that you're doing it because I've been, you guys have put out some really good resources over the years, a couple of which we're here to talk about today, but I did want to have this conversation now in the middle of the season, both because I'm a big greenhouse nerd myself and to address some of those mid-season greenhouse crop management questions, especially since greenhouse crops like tomatoes, cucumbers, and the other long season vegetable and flower crops can't be fertilized entirely before planting, because if you truly put all the fertility these crops need down pre-plant, there would be just way too much of everything, and that would mess with plant growth. As most people know, you really can't have too much of a good thing with fertility, right? I think a lot of people know that if you have too much of one element, it can often interfere with the uptake or cause problems with a lot of the other elements. So here we are, early June. I wanted this to be like a mid-season check-in to help growers determine their fertility strategy for the rest of the season, right? Because a lot of the heat is still in front of us. If they want to keep those long season crops healthy, they're going to need to be supplementing. So
Absolutely.
I wanted to talk about what is different for greenhouse soil from what growers might be used to with field soil. So, for example, if growers get a greenhouse soil test, it will give recommendations for how much fertility a crop is going to need. But do you have any suggestions to help growers figure out how much of that fertility to put down pre-plant versus supplemental during the season?
Yeah, that's a great question, pre-plant versus supplemental. So if we're supplementing in season, that tends to assume that we can deliver nutrients in a soluble fashion. And so that requires drip irrigation and it requires an injection system. And within that injection system, we need to be able to calculate how much of any given nutrient is going out during a fertigation event. And so that gets into a question of solubility and really affordability of nutrients. So if someone is certified organic, do they have the nutrients they need available to them in a soluble form that can be injected with small amounts over time? And then is it economical? Because those sources of nutrients that are soluble and certified organic tend to be very expensive. So those are a couple of things that are going to influence our decision. How much do we put down pre-plant if we're going to, and how much can we supplement? So to your point, Andrew, is we can't put down 100% of our fertility demands pre-plant, at least particularly not with nitrogen, because that's going to front load the system, in a sense, make it too hot, we'll call it. And we're just pushing too much vegetative growth early on. So if we move off of nitrogen and we look at our other nutrients, there we might be able to put down most, if not all, of, say, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, our micronutrients ahead of time, and then avoid some of the expense of finding soluble forms of that and applying them or injecting them mid-season. But in order to do that, we need a soil test. So that's the classic extension piece of advice, and I think it's a good one, is we need a soil test before we make any decisions on nutrient applications, either pre-plant or in season. And I suggest the best time to do a soil test is in the fall, if we're growing, say, a summer fruiting vegetable in the Northeast US or Eastern Canada, is take that soil test in the fall when the soil is still warm, biologically active, and that gives us hopefully the most accurate snapshot of what we need to do pre-plant for the coming season. And also if we need to make, say, adjustments to pH, and most of the time we're trying to adjust pH down in high tunnel soils, we can make those applications in the fall and give them time to take effect before the spring.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really good advice. And it may sound, I don't know if it sounds obvious to be like, get a soil test. But
right.
Like one of the things I used to do, I used to work for Johnny Seeds. I would help people troubleshoot because I was doing a lot of the trialing for greenhouse crops. And so if people had questions, they called in at Johnny's, and like the people answering the phone didn't know the answer, they would send the questions along to me. And I can't tell you how many times I got like pictures, of a sick looking plant.
Yep.
And I'd be like, well, that looks a lot like a, X deficiency. It looks like a potassium deficiency or something. And I'd be like, what does your soil test say? And people are like, I don't know, because I don't have one. And so like, I get it. I feel like there's a certain tension there between people who are more, actually, we had an article back in the Growing for Market at the end of 2025 talking about greenhouse soil fertility. And the author called it a more vibes-based approach to soil fertility versus the actual getting a soil test and knowing what's in there. Like, I know a ton of growers who don't get a soil test. I guess that's why I'm belaboring this point, right? Because
Sure.
you're like, get a soil test. I think that's very good advice. It's very obvious, but I also know a lot of people don't. And like, okay, that's fine if you're not going to, but I think that's such basic advice. It's worth getting one because it really will tell you not only what your imbalances are, but how things are changing over time, right? As you say in your publication, like get a soil test every year, because then if you get one every year, you can see what the trend is, not just the snapshot, but if kind of getting ahead of myself, but like if your soil is trending acidic or basic or phosphorus is building up, or whatever, it's going to show you that trend. So I just wanted to like second that emotion on getting a soil test. I think it's really the basis of a lot of stuff.
I agree, and it's let's call it $20. That's what a basic soil test cost you in New York State is still actually less than $20. We'll call it $20, and you look at the revenue potential out of, say, a standard 3,000 square foot growing space, that the revenue potential there can be five figures. It's worth the $20 to know what you need to do. And I see soil tests that have 2 pounds of phosphorus per acre, and I see soil tests that have 600 pounds of phosphorus per acre. So the difference between those two values is enormous. So yeah, I'm also putting a fine point on this. It is probably, I don't want to say it's the most important piece of information to have because water is right there with it, but it is absolutely essential to have that soil test. Otherwise, you don't know what you're applying or what you need to apply. And the key difference here between growing in the soil and growing hydroponically is that the soil acts as a massive bank for a number of these positively charged plant nutrients, such as potassium and calcium and magnesium. And so that's the difference, is that over time, we're most likely accumulating those nutrients in the soil. And we need to know, how do we manage that bank of nutrients in the soil? And so to your point, Andrew, someone may show you a photo that you can make a fairly accurate diagnosis of. That looks like magnesium deficiency or potassium deficiency, but the solution isn't always simply add more magnesium or add more potassium. There may be other things that we have to manage there because maybe those values are already very elevated. That's why the soil test matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the soil test in a greenhouse specifically, would you recommend the greenhouse soil test, right? So there's a field soil test, and then there's a greenhouse soil test, which I think is also called the saturated media extract test. Different I know different labs have different nomenclature. Okay, so and when we're talking about getting a soil test for a high tunnel or greenhouse, you mean that the greenhouse soil test, the saturated media extract test specifically?
That's a great question. And so the SME test, for short, the greenhouse test, is in a sense, it's really a test of soil. It's more geared towards soilless mixtures to greenhouse potting soil. And so the question of whether you're using a traditional soil test or an SME test, for me, is about organic matter. And so as high tunnel or greenhouse growers push organic matter higher and higher in their soil inside that environment, it begins to resemble a potting soil, both physically and in terms of how it behaves with water and nutrients to some degree. So the question is, when does it become high enough in organic matter to move towards an SME test, saturated media extract test? I would suggest if you're moving towards, say, 10% organic matter, it's probably time to begin considering an SME test. 10% organic matter soils in a mineral-based soil, an outdoor soil, those are quite rare, actually. And so once you're moving towards 10% organic matter, you're moving into more of an artificial soil or media, and the SME test may be more relevant. And again, it's easy for me to say, but I also see a value in doing both. If you want to make more informed decisions, if you have a traditional mineral soil test and an SME test on hand, you can begin to look at what is available in this soil itself and also what is available in the soil extract. In other words, what is available in solution if water moves through this soil profile. And those are going to give you two different sets of data. Here's, in a sense, a bank or a store of nutrients based on this traditional soil test. And here's what those nutrients might look like available in an extract format.
Okay, so does that mean that let's say you ran both of those soil tests, right? You like out there taking your soil test, you make two different boxes or baggies or whatever you're sending in. You send two batches of soil from the same greenhouse, one for the saturated media extract or the greenhouse soil test, one for the regular field soil test. Are you saying that the field soil test is going to give you a better idea of all the nutrients that are held there that are going to be available over time that aren't necessarily all available right away, and that the SME or greenhouse soil test is going to tell you what's available in the water that goes through that soil? That's more like what's quickly available?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That's what I would suggest there, except that traditional soil test, the nutrients may or may not be available over time. There's other factors but it gives you a more comprehensive look at what potentially could be released to plants if everything is in an ideal state, particularly biology and the physical status of the soil too.
Okay. And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. If you grow for market, you know performance is everything. That's why so many farmers are turning to Burpee's Farmers Market. Dedicated to professional growers, Burpee is now offering non-GMO seeds in larger quantities, bred and selected for standout flavor, strong yields, and the kind of visual appeal your customers crave. All farmers market varieties are trialed at Burpee's Research Farm in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, where expert horticulturalists test for germination rate, vigor, disease resistance, high yield, and consistency, things that make a difference in the field and to your bottom line. The seed assortment includes USDA certified organic varieties, Burpee bred classics, heirlooms, and exciting new introductions. Burpee's been doing this for 150 years, and they're still creating new varieties with growers like you in mind. You can check out the full lineup at burpee.com/farmersmarket. That's burpee.com/farmersmarket. This episode is sponsored by Nifty Hoops. Nifty Hoops designs and builds high tunnel systems for growers who want dependable results. What stands out is that Nifty Hoops tunnels are complete systems designed by experienced builders with the details worked out ahead of time. That means the core components are included from the start, like end walls, ventilation, doors, baseboards, and double layer poly, rather than being added later. The tunnels are designed for real wind and snow loads, efficient assembly, and long service life. You can choose a self-build kit with guidance from written manuals and videos, or a community build where Nifty Hoops works alongside you and the project gets completed in one day. Nifty Hoops has built more than 1,500 hoop houses across the country, including many funded through the NRCS High Tunnel Initiative. They're known nationwide for predictable outcomes and ongoing support. If you're planning a high tunnel project and want it done right, you can learn more at niftyhoops.com. And now, back to the show. So based on that, let's say a person gets their soil test. Do you have any sense of how much they should be basing their mid-season fertility decisions on that soil test? Why I'm asking this question is because I know some growers take almost like a approach that it doesn't matter what's in the soil test. They just add they almost have like a monthly or a bi-weekly addition of fertilizer. Like they know the plants are growing, they're going to need some nitrogen. Some NPK and all the micros, and they almost have like a formula that they apply, on just some regular basis. Thinking of almost like a conveyor belt attitude, right? On the one hand, tomatoes are going out of the greenhouse, they take some nitrogen, a lot of potassium, all those kinds of things. And so they're like, well, we're basically exporting some of our fertility in the form of tomatoes. And so we just need to keep adding fertility. And so do you think growers should base what they're adding during the season a lot on that soil test, or just know that their crops are using up a lot of all those nutrients and just like try and replace what's being lost through the course of the season?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. So I think the soil test is most valuable pre-plant. And in terms of making that decision, I'm going to say put down half of my nitrogen budget prior to planting and then supplement that throughout the season. And then I'm going to, let's say I have high levels of phosphorus, magnesium, calcium, potassium, which is very common in high tunnels, and I'm not going to apply those. However, to your point about there's a conveyor belt and that plants are taking up nutrients, hopefully, and as growers, we're exporting those nutrients in the form of harvested vegetable crops or fruit crops. And the plant is storing those nutrients in quite a bit of vegetative mass as well. So the next set of tests that help us with the decision about do I continue to apply nutrients, and let's say it is in that recipe approach that you're talking about, assuming that there's a lot leaving the system, are foliar tests. And so then the foliar tests, for me, give me a snapshot of how good a job have I done as a grower in balancing nutrients in the soil, and how good a job is the plant doing at accessing those nutrients, or the microbes doing at facilitating the transfer of the nutrients into the crop. And so in that case, if I have a foliar test and I can see that my crop is deficient in any given nutrient, I'm not going to allow that plant to starve on that nutrient simply because I'm overloaded in the soil or have high levels in the soil. What I'm seeing is, okay, I have high levels in the soil, but the plant's not accessing it. I'm willing to provide that in a soluble format through a fertigation program that you might be describing to make sure that my plant is at optimum levels, even though my soil might be saturated. I think that's a commercial grower is well served with a foliar test so that they can take that approach. But to the growers that are not going to soil test or not going to foliar test and are going to take that recipe approach with the assumption that nutrients are being exported, my question for them is, how many years are you going to do that? How many years are you going to get away with that? Because again, the soil acts as a bank and your nutrients will continue to accumulate, and the accumulation of those nutrients, particularly phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, is going to restrict the uptake of other nutrients. And so then you get into a challenging situation where you're trying to force feed plants, in particular potassium and sometimes micronutrients as well. So that foliar test is very important, is going to help make decisions for me in terms of, do I continue to add to support that conveyor belt, or do I not need to?
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad you brought that up because that's another really good resource that I don't know how many people are taking advantage of with the foliar testing, right? Because I feel like that's the only way to know. It's sort of like a soil test can tell you what's going on in the soil, but it's hard to know. Yeah, let's say the plant isn't performing as well as you'd hoped. It's hard to know whether that's because something in the soil isn't working right or if something in the plant isn't working right. And the foliar test will let you know what's actually getting into the plant.
Absolutely.
And so, okay, I do want in the guide you recommended growers do a yearly soil test and keep close track on the phosphorus and calcium. And so you were just mentioning this. I want to loop back and ask you, why do you key in on those two nutrients specifically?
So phosphorus in particular becomes very saturated, I find, in soil-based greenhouses. And that's because it's usually delivered at a ratio of between nitrogen and potassium that is close to 1 to 1 to 1, whether that's in a compost or an organic fertilizer or a conventional fertilizer. In short, the amount of phosphorus that is there is excessive. In a fertilizer analysis, just as a reminder, phosphorus is the middle number. So for a conventional grower, a classic fertilizer might be a triple 20, 20% nitrogen, 20% phosphorus, 20% potassium. And neither the soil nor the crop benefits from having phosphorus at that very high ratio to the other two nutrients there. And so over time, that phosphorus accumulates in the soil, and then that high level of phosphorus interferes with the uptake of, say, potassium. So if we look at nitrogen and potassium in particular, when a tomato crop is in its fruiting stage, it needs potassium at really a 3-to-1 ratio, nitrogen to potassium. So if my total budget for nitrogen for a growing season might be 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per crop, the crop may need, in that case, 450 or 500 pounds, let's call it, of potassium per acre per year. So it's a very high demand in order to have nice red tomatoes. If that phosphorus level is as high as the potassium level, the crop may not be able to take up the potassium it needs just due to the excess levels of phosphorus. That's why I pay a lot of attention to phosphorus, because generally it's there at a ratio that we really don't need it. And so in year 1 and year 2, things look good, everything's green. Year 3, year 4, we begin to see some nutrient deficiencies that are difficult to correct. I think was the other nutrient you mentioned calcium, Andrew?
Yes. Yeah, it was calcium.
Yeah. So I also focus in on calcium because calcium is closely related to soil pH. And so as soil calcium levels go up, pH also tends to go up. And as pH tends to go up and become above 7 or alkaline, we also have multiple nutrient deficiencies becoming more common as our pH. So oftentimes calcium for me is really about pH management. So I want to move quickly, if we can, to where does all this calcium come from? And so it does come from compost, it comes from fertilizers, but oftentimes it comes from our water. And so that's the third test I really encourage growers to have, is a water test. So they can have an idea of how much calcium is in their irrigation water. And calcium in irrigation water is oftentimes indicated by a couple of terms. One is alkalinity or calcium bicarbonate, and both of those are reported in parts per million. And where this is really relevant is if we think about water inside of a greenhouse or a high tunnel, it's the most important input that we have, either by volume or by weight, because we don't have rain in there. So we're supplying 100% of the crop's water demand through irrigation. And if we're in the heat of summer and we have a large, tall, fruiting vegetable in there, we could be applying up to 500 gallons of water on a daily basis, 6 or 7 days a week. Wow, we're looking at maybe 3,000 gallons of water per week A gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. 8 times 3,000 is 24,000. So we're putting in 24,000 pounds of water on a weekly basis in the peak of season. And if that water has, say, a high level of calcium bicarbonate of 300 parts per million, I'm applying a lot of calcium on a weekly basis. So if I don't have a water test to understand what my calcium level is, I quickly saturate the calcium of the soil, and then the pH becomes too high.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've talked to a few growers who have gotten in that situation where they didn't think about the impact of irrigation water on the greenhouse. And like you said, there's no rain to buffer it out, or, that it's 100% of the water is coming from your well, right? In fact, the article about high tunnel greenhouse fertility that we ran at the end of last year also talks about this. And they didn't understand how their soil got so basic. And because I think that they may not have also been soil testing. And so they didn't see that, they never tested their water. So they didn't know how acidic or basic it was. They didn't know what also nutrients were in it, right? Because like I live in a rural area here in central Maine. I know a lot of rural areas have hard water, which can mean different nutrients are in the water. But so another reason to get your water tested, like if you have hard water, that generally means that you have some kind of nutrients in your water that is maybe important to plants if you're doing a lot of irrigation with it. And so they didn't, it's like all of a sudden the plants stopped growing as well. And it turns out they had just, like irrigated with water that was making the soil more alkaline.
Yes.
Over time. And they didn't realize that trend because they weren't getting the soil test, and they didn't realize where it was coming from because they didn't have the water test. So, the water test is the kind of thing you can do once, or like you may only just have to do that once, right? Because if you're irrigating from like well water, like we are here, your aquifer is pretty stable, right? You probably just have to do that test once and find out what the pH is and what nutrients are in your well water. And then you pretty much know for a lifetime, right?
I agree. Yeah, it's not an annual test for me, particularly again when you have a stable water source like a well. You're not going to see a lot of variability there. Some growers are on municipal water, and if you're on municipal water, you can request a water quality report. Hopefully that has this value on there. As a ratepayer for that municipal water, you should have access to that. Surface water, so if someone's irrigating out of a pond or a stream or some other body of water, those have greater fluctuations, and that's a little bit harder to manage because of snow melt and seasonal fluctuations, surface runoff. All of those things are going to change your water over time. Those are tougher water sources to manage. But yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. A well is relatively stable. And if you get a test and you get into a program to manage that water, you're probably going to be okay over time. Maybe you revisit it every few years, but I agree, it's fairly stable. Now, I want to quickly talk about what do I mean by manage this. And so the reason we're talking about calcium and pH in irrigation water is with the hope that we can manage that if we need to. So very often what we see is that those, particularly well water, can be high in dissolved calcium and pH. And in those cases, we would like to lower that for the reasons we've discussed here. And to do that, we inject an acid on an ongoing basis, not a one-time event or even a weekly event. Rather, this is every irrigation event. And I think of it as preventative maintenance. If a day or two goes by and you didn't acidify your water, it's not the end of the world. But on an ongoing basis, many growers I work with are acidifying their water to lower the alkalinity that we're talking about here. And to do that, you need the water test, so you understand how much acid you need to introduce to the system. You do not want to guess at that for a number of reasons, safety reasons, right? So once you have that, then there's some online resources. Once you have a pH value and an alkalinity value, there are online resources that would help you calculate how much acid to add on a daily basis or on a per volume basis of irrigation water. Your local extension educator should also be able to help you with that, or your land-grant university or a number of consultants could help you with that as well. Generally, what we're talking about is a very small amount of acid to a relatively large volume of water.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of options. We have, for organic growers, we have citric acid. It's generally the acid of choice to lower irrigation water pH and alkalinity. And for growers that are not certified organic, sulfuric acid is a common material to work with to lower pH and alkalinity. Working with acids is dangerous. Just want to put that out there. But it is, in my experience, for growers with alkaline water, it's essential for long-term production inside. To your point, Andrew, outdoors, this really doesn't matter. We have snow, we have rain, and that's going to buffer out the effects of alkaline irrigation water. But indoors, it really matters because we just don't have that leaching.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I would think that if your soil is in the right range, like say slightly acidic, let's say soil acidity at 6.5%, so slightly acidic, or what do you make a recommendation for? What do you say like the ideal soil pH? I know it's slightly acidic. Do you have a specific number we can talk about here?
I think you're fine anywhere between 6 and 6.5. Yeah. I think 6.2 is great, but I think between 6 and 6.5, maybe 6.2 and 6.5, I don't expect to see pH related nutrient deficiencies.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just say, for argument's sake, your pH is in your greenhouse. You've done your soil test. It's 6.2. It's like, okay, great. Yep. And so, is your recommendation that growers would add a little bit of citric acid or acid of choice if their water is alkaline? Let's say 6.2. Make your irrigation water 6.2, because if it's at where you really want it to be, and you want it to stay at that level, is that what you would do? Would you make your irrigation water the target that you want for your soil if your soil is about where you want it to be anyway?
That's a very reasonable approach. And so you can set a target pH for your irrigation water, or you could set a target alkalinity for your water as well. Alkalinity, again, generally measured as dissolved calcium bicarbonate in the water. And so you could set, say, a low target for your alkalinity, maybe of 50 parts per million, 25 to 50 parts per million. Or you could set a pH target of, say, 6.2 or wherever you want to be there. But I think you're leading us to a great point here, Andrew, which is we are not trying to solve a soil pH problem by acidifying our irrigation water. We're trying to prevent it. The amount of acid we would have to add through irrigation to reverse a soil pH problem is just excessive and unrealistic. So that's where I think of it as preventative maintenance. And if, let's say, you ran out of acid for a week and you couldn't get any from your local farm store, it's not the end of the world. This is about preventing a problem.
Right. Okay, well, that brings up another question that is a bit more of a hypothetical. I think that was a very good answer. So I do actually have some friends who are growing in a fairly new greenhouse that's pretty alkaline.
Yep.
And so I think the nutrients aren't being taken up as well as they could be by the plants. And so you may have just answered the question. Like you just said, acidified irrigation water isn't going to solve your pH. Like I assume you put down calcium carbonate or do something when there aren't plants in the ground to address that. But if someone finds themselves growing in a greenhouse that's too alkaline, okay, so I realize this is a hypothetical and maybe there's not an answer here at all, but I was thinking, can they make their irrigation water a little bit more acidic than, say, 6.2?
Right.
To try and remedy. Okay, because I know you can't make your irrigation water like pH of 2, thinking like, oh, I'll make it really acidic and then that'll counteract the alkalinity in the soil. So I'm sure that's an extreme example. I don't know what would happen, but I'm pretty sure your plants would not be happy if you put irrigation water pH of 2 on the roots. But I think you see where I'm going with this. Is like, sure. And this might be a hypothetical. I wouldn't be surprised if you don't have an answer. But can you make your irrigation water more acidic to try to counteract if you are growing in alkaline soil, or would you be setting yourself up to burn your plant's roots?
Well, you're probably right in that I don't know, but not knowing usually doesn't prevent me from giving an answer. So. So I'll try to talk my way through that. If I was that grower, I would probably move in that direction of dropping my irrigation water pH a little bit further, let's say down to, say, 6.0, with the hope that in solution, more nutrients are going to be available, say, within that root zone. So I'm saturating the root zone with a irrigation water with a pH of 6.0, either there's nutrients that I'm providing in that fertigation event, or they're already in that root zone through a pre-plant application or years of accumulation, and they're going to become more available in that brief time of the roots accessing a lower pH solution. Now, if the soil calcium is very high, I don't stand much of a chance of turning it around, right? Because the buffer that I'm trying to overcome with acidified water in the soil is simply too high. So I would, that's a long answer, but I would say if I was in that grower's shoes, I would probably take the approach that you're pondering there is, can I drop this a little bit further? And then to your previous point, I would be very focused in the off season, if there is an off season, to trying to lower the soil pH through other applications such as elemental sulfur, putting out a sulfur dust in the fall to disassociate the calcium in that soil and hopefully lower the pH. Or the other material people use is peat moss. People will apply peat moss, which adds organic matter to the soil, but is naturally acidic and low in pH and doesn't add additional nutrients to the soil, which again, we're trying to avoid.
Yes. Okay. Well, that's a really good point, and I think that loops back on the point you were making about treating the soil in the greenhouse almost like a giant pot. Like I know when we established our hoop houses, we put a lot of compost, and I think we put peat moss and all kinds of things to try to raise the organic matter. Before we had our first crop in there, just to try to get the soil as good as possible, because the greenhouse is the most valuable real estate on the farm, right? We bought the frame, put it up ourselves, so we got a lot invested in that area, and so we felt like we're gonna go the extra mile and make almost like super soil in there as far as like higher organic matter than we had in the field, and make sure the fertility is really good and everything, because that's where we stand to make the most. And we also have, well, actually kind of like your 10 reasons not to grow in a high tunnel publication, which I want to talk about in a minute. I think, sure. I feel like that's one of the points you're making, is that it's the highest investment part of the farm, so it's also the highest risk part of the farm if it doesn't pay off. Because I know that is one thing that I've seen. Like, I think your recommendation about watching the phosphorus levels, because it does seem like a lot of the compost that's made with like a lot of green materials like manure or composted fresh plant matter tends to have more phosphorus than the plants really need. And so I feel like that was a pattern that I would see with a lot of growers that I worked with, is that those that were applying a lot of compost year after year, over time, like you were saying, the phosphorus level would get too high. And so our recommendation was like, well, to get a soil test so you know what it is. And then if you get to the point where your phosphorus level is adequate, or where you want it to be, then stop applying compost, or apply compost only up to that level to satisfy the phosphorus needs, and then do other more like single nutrient compost applications, or basically something with not phosphorus,
yes,
to keep from getting that overloaded. Okay. And so, yeah, because sometimes I would think about our hoop houses as just like, they're like giant pots, or like I would think about them kind of like like potting soil. It's like, mm-hmm. We want to make sure the plants have the best everything. So I thought,
I think a lot of those compost applications are satisfying for a grower because they improve the physical tilth of the soil, particularly in a heavy soil. And however, I think there's other ways to improve the physical tilth of the soil besides compost. Compost is great, but if we're really trying to improve the physical status of the soil and the biology of the soil, I think cover crops are a great way to go there, and that we're not adding those excess phosphorus levels that you're talking about, but we are improving other indicators of soil health, such as aggregate stability or organic matter or soil respiration, and not saturating those nutrient levels.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you made that. Actually, also I'm getting confused. It's either at the end of 2025 or I think it was actually early 2026. We had an article all about cover cropping in high tunnels and greenhouses in the magazine. And so it's in the archive. People can go find that. And one of the trade-off, they talked about the whole trade-off about how the high tunnel and greenhouse real estate tends to be in high demand. And sometimes it's hard to find a time to cover crop. But they were talking about, it was by a grower who had done a fair amount of cover cropping in high tunnels, and their conclusion was that they thought it was worth it. They thought they saw they saw some benefits, despite the fact they had to take a break from cropping to grow the cover crop, but they experienced really good benefits with that. So that's a really good point. And I think you had mentioned some other things too. Let's say if they can't find the time to cover crop, like you mentioned, peat moss. And I think I've heard of people adding cocoa coir. I've heard of people making like leaf compost, if like a compost that is mostly what people like brown matter, like leaves or something that's not high in nitrogen, so that they could make a compost that's high in organic matter, but isn't really high in nutrients, for people to apply more for the soil conditioning properties than nutrients. So there's a lot of options right there if people want to try and raise the organic matter. Which actually, that reminds me, do you have a recommendation on an ideal level of organic matter in a high tunnel? Because like I've talked to some field growers who got organic matter up really high, like into the teens, and one of their points was that when the organic matter was that high, plants had a tendency to almost just like keel over. Like the soil was so light and fluffy. So organic matter, I feel like, is one of those things. More organic matter tends to make things grow better. But is there an upper limit on organic matter? If people should be so lucky to have that problem of too much organic matter?
It's a tough question to answer, because the percent organic matter, your potential, is going to depend to a certain degree on the texture of your soil, so the mineral fraction of your soil. And so, for example, in a well-drained soil, a sandy soil, it's a challenge to have an organic matter, say, above 6%. If you have a sandy soil and you can get an organic matter of 6%, you're doing quite well. Now, as you have more silt or more clay fraction as a mineral component of your soil, your potential for organic matter is much higher, because again, the mineral particle size is that much smaller, and you have much more opportunity for aggregation and putting that organic matter to use than you do in a well-drained soil or sandy soil. So in those cases, I can see healthy organic matters that may exceed 10%. Maybe you can get to 8, 10, 12%. I would challenge people and ask them, if you're going to an organic matter of above, say, 15%, what is your goal? Why are you trying to push to that high level of an organic matter? Is it for biology? Is it for soil structure? Or is it for nutrients? Because once we get too high, your soil structure actually begins to fall apart, right? And it resembles, as you're describing, a potting soil that has no, what we call, aggregate stability. It falls apart in your hands, and to this point of plants falling over, it may be because there is no aggregate stability in that soil, because it is so high organic matter that the root system is just growing through this very loose, unstable physical structure of soil. So I don't see a benefit from that. We do a lot of work with urban soils here, and some of those do indeed they're entirely compost based due to site restrictions or the underlying soil being unsuitable for crop production. And you might think, well, that's ideal. You've got an organic matter of near 100%. There are a lot of challenges to working with those soils in terms of, over time, they can become what we call hydrophobic, in terms of, are they allowing water to pass through, and do they hold on to water if they don't have a lot of aggregate stability, or is that water just moving through and moving away? How quickly do those soils dry off? Now, let's say if you hit a hot, dry period, and then to compensate for how much moisture they wick, in a sense, like a sponge, as a grower, now do you need to irrigate excessively? And so is that a demand on you as a grower? Can you provide enough water, given how much water is moving out of that system during heat? And if you're evaporating that much water, what are we leaving behind in terms of salts, other nutrients, or other solids in that irrigation water? So I would just challenge people, what is your goal in increasing organic matter? And then what are the risks if you get to these very high levels of, say, 20%? 20% organic matter soil also has a fair amount of background nitrogen stored in that organic matter. And that sounds good, in that the less nitrogen that we have to purchase and supplement, the better, in my opinion. However, the release of that nitrogen now becomes very unpredictable and is going to be dependent on soil biology, moisture, and temperature. And so what we see oftentimes in high organic matter soils is that we can have a real flush of nitrogen released, which pushes a lot of vegetative growth. It might delay maturity on, say, some fruiting vegetables. And excess foliage is not a good idea for a number of reasons, that we can get foliar diseases just because we're too lush, say gray mold and things like that. So organic matter is great, but organic matter itself is not the goal of soil management or farming in general.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for saying so, because I mean, generally I think of like organic matter is, I tend to think like, oh, things grow better the more organic matter there is, but like most things in agriculture, there can be too much. So that gives us a good guideline for perhaps how much is too much. Hey, I have another question for you that I haven't been able to find the details on. So I know there used to be a limit on the amount of fertility that you could apply in drip, or what people call fertigation, like what we've been talking about, like acidifying your irrigation water. And I was looking around to try to find the percentage, and I could not find a reliable source on it. So actually, right before the interview, I emailed a friend at MOFGA to try to ask him if that regulation still exists and what the number is. Do you know what the status of that is? Like, basically, the idea was sort of like, if they allowed organic growers to apply all their supplemental fertility through drip, you're basically just recreating hydroponics in soil. And so I think the idea was that, of course, you can fertigate in organics, but that 100% of your supplemental fertility shouldn't come through fertigation. Do you know, I guess, like the status of that rule, if you're still not supposed to apply all your supplemental fertility through drip? And if you don't know, I hopefully my friend will get back to me and I can clarify in the show notes or something like that. And I guess, like, have you ever dealt with growers on how to split that up, like side dress some of your supplemental and drip and fertigate the other part?
Yeah, and no, I don't have an update on that regulation. And is that, I think, an important question, is that certifier based, or is that the USDA certified organic program based? What I recall is it was either 15 or 25% of your total nitrogen budget should not be coming from, say, a single source. The classic one is Chilean nitrate, which is a mined source of nitrogen. It's organic, but behaves similar to, say, urea or a conventional source of nitrogen. And I think the spirit of those regulations is to have the organic grower focus on the soil being ideally the source of nutrition and not supplemental forms. What's not clear to me has been, if let's say I use 15% of my total nitrogen budget in Chilean nitrogen, could I then use another, say, 15% from another organic source, such, say, as blood meal, which could be side dressed, let's say, worked into the soil? You can't inject blood meal effectively. Or now today, we do have more plant-based, say, soy-based, soluble nitrogen sources. And to what percent can those be fertigated over time? And that's a question, I think, to your certifier, what is going to be acceptable there. But I have worked with growers that do try to adhere to the spirit of that, while at the same time availing themselves of what is available in a soluble form. And so the approach we've taken there is to front load the system with a more bulk form of organic nitrogen, such as feather meal, peanut meal, soy meal, alfalfa meal. Incorporate that perhaps at a 50% rate of your total budget. So that for us would be around 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And then take foliar tests throughout the year to see, is the plant accessing that pre-plant that application, that front-loaded application? And if not, can we do little microdoses of nitrogen with an acceptable form throughout the year? And a couple of different things can happen. One is your front loading nitrogen at times might not be immediately available, and it might be early in the season that you need to provide that soluble nitrogen, or you can, in a sense, use up all of that nitrogen, and by later in the season, you might need to inject some or fertigate some. But really, foliar testing is what's going to allow us to make those decisions.
Yeah. Okay.
The other thing I'll throw in here, Andrew, is for growers that are trying to adhere to a more organic approach to nitrogen or nutrient management in general, I encourage them to also look at what variety are you growing? Are you growing a variety that was bred around a entirely conventional fertigation system with very, very high nutrient demands and very accentuated demands, say for a tomato, a very high yielding, large fruited determinate variety that has a very peak demand over a space of weeks, that is really not reasonable to expect an organic nutrient system to deliver the nutrients that that plant was really bred for.
Oh, okay.
And so this is where I think indeterminate tomatoes that have a more balanced fruit and foliar pacing throughout the season. So you're setting a cluster of fruit, you're developing a set of leaves, you're setting a cluster of fruit, etc. That nutrient demand is going to be a little bit more steady state. Now it still comes and goes with sunlight and temperature, etc. However, I encourage organic growers that don't want to be dependent on soluble nutrients to think about a variety that has a more even production schedule.
That's good advice, and that's really interesting. I never really thought about it that way, about how, yeah, the determinate tomatoes that have a really concentrated fruit set, you're right, they're going to need a lot of potassium. I mean, and everything. I think about potassium because I know how important potassium is for ripening, right? And like you said, you mentioned how tomato plants need a very high amount of potassium over the course of the season. So that makes sense. It's good advice. While we're on the topic of side dressing, I wanted to ask you about a specific thing. A number of years back, I was working in a greenhouse where somebody side dressed with blood meal, and the plants suffered a pretty bad fertilizer burn. And I was told that sometimes products that are high in nitrogen can have more of an aggressive effect in a controlled environment. Are you familiar with that phenomenon? And do you know how strong is too strong for application in a greenhouse, other than trial and error?
That's a great question. And I think the reason trial and error, or ideally just trial, is the best approach is that every soil is different. And so a lot of those nitrogen burns are going to depend on, for organic fertilizers, such as blood meal, is how quickly is the nitrate form of nitrogen available in solution, and is it at such a high level that it burns the roots or uptake becomes excessive? And I've seen that too in organic greenhouses where there was just too much nitrogen available all at once, and we burned a lot of foliage. So our general guideline is a tomato crop indoors is going to use somewhere between 5 to 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre per week. If we err on the lower side of that and say 5 pounds per week, now the question is, if we're side dressing a material like blood meal, are we applying all of those 5 pounds at once? And how concentrated was that application within the soil profile? It's probably going to be much more concentrated than a soluble form, which is being fertigated and distributed throughout with soil moisture. Whereas this physical application of blood meal, it's concentrated spatially within the root zone. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And if the biology is there and the temperature is there, that can lead to just too much nitrogen all at once. That's one of the challenges I've seen. So for that reason, I would probably err on the lighter side of an application of a material like blood meal.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. I think this was a greenhouse where its crops weren't growing very well, and yeah, I don't know if it was too cold. I forget exact. I mean, we didn't have the full breakdown. Where it's just like, okay, this crop is not taking off. Like, let's just throw some blood meal on it. And so, yeah, maybe blood meal can be obviously can be used well in a greenhouse or a hoop house, but they may have just overdone it, just putting, just dropping too much blood meal by the plants. And one quick thing that I'd like to throw in there about side dressing in greenhouses is that I think it can help if you have ground cover and can pull the ground cover back and side dress and then cover the fertilizer that you just applied back up. Because I know many years ago, I don't know, we've gone through a lot of iterations on our hoop houses. And I think one year when we didn't have ground cover, or at least it wasn't all the way up to the plants, I know I put side dress some material down there and then just watched it grow mold because it's just sitting, it's hot, humid environment sitting on top of the soil. And I think that mineralize, is one of the words, like it doesn't mineralize as well, which tell me, but I think that just means, like becoming available, turning from a form that you're putting on the soil, or maybe you can tell me what mineralization is. But what I've noticed is that people who pull the cover back, put down their side dress fertilizer, and then cover it back up, of course, because of the drip tape and all the stuff down there, it will get wet faster. And then you'll see, like in tomato greenhouses like that, you'll see tomato roots. Like if you peel back the ground cover, you'll see tomato roots all the way up to the surface coming to get what you've just side dressed on there, because the ground cover, right, is trapping the moisture. So it's keeping it wet right up to the soil level. And so the roots aren't going to go where it's dry. And so if you keep the soil wet all the way up to the surface like that, the fertilizer will get wet and then the roots will grow into it. So yeah, can you tell us what exactly does it mean when they say like fertilizer is like mineralized?
Sure. So it's a fancy way of saying, in particular, nitrogen is becoming a plant available. So there's many forms of nitrogen, and mineralization generally is referring to a microbial process where non-plant available forms of nitrogen are made available to the plant, most often in what we call nitrate. And so nitrate nitrogen is a form of nitrogen that moves through the root membranes very easily, moves across in solution. So in other words, in moisture, soil moisture, through root tissues and obviously into the plant's vascular system, and is immediately available for the plant to use. That's really what mineralization refers to. And so with organic fertility sources, much of the nitrogen is not immediately available. And that, in a way, can be a good thing in that we create a background, more stable form of nitrogen in the soil that is not as easily volatilized or lost to the environment or leached. And then the soil microbes ideally are converting that into a nitrate form of nitrogen that the plants can take up quickly. That's what we mean when we say mineralization.
Okay.
And in your example of using ground cover, I don't know for certain, but I wonder if also we are keeping the soil, to your point, more moist, but also perhaps a little bit cooler. Now, ground cover itself, oftentimes it's black, is different than, say, black plastic mulch, which is in very tight contact with the soil and is heating the soil. A ground cover that has looser contact with the soil may actually be keeping it a little bit cooler. And so that conversion or mineralization may be happening at a slower rate, which is probably a good thing. And also cooling roots, particularly in a greenhouse, can also be a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I'd say so, because a lot of the people that I know growing in greenhouses are using light colored, like landscape fabric or whatever the ground cover is. So that would be doing that. It would be actually cooling the root zone instead of heating it up like black plastic out in the field.
Yeah. And again, that's where I see high organic matter soils that are left uncovered and they're very dark in color. Those soils become very hot.
Yeah.
They become physically hot, which is not always a good thing.
Okay. Well, we have hopped around and covered most of the stuff that I wanted to talk about from the greenhouse soil perspective. There's one thing in particular I wanted to ask you about from your 10 reasons not to grow in a hoop house. And so I also wanted to give you, if you want to talk any more about that, give you a chance to talk about why people might consider not growing in a hoop house. But okay, so one of the things you talk about in the 10 reasons not to grow in a hoop house is negative R values, or as you put it, under early and late season, short and cloudy days and clear, cold nights, it's possible to have lower temperatures last longer in a high tunnel than outdoors. And so I've noticed this too, but it's hard to explain. And so can you explain how that's possible to have lower temperatures lasting longer in a high tunnel than outdoors? Like what's going on there?
Yeah, I can attempt to explain, and I agree. At times it feels a little bit counterintuitive. But if we look at the high tunnel in the springtime, the soil is cold. It's not a heat reservoir like it might be in the summer or in the fall, where it's absorbed months of radiative heat. And the soil is very cool. And the high tunnel, if it has a single layer of plastic on it, that single layer of plastic is capable of radiating heat very effectively. It has, as I describe it, a negative R value. R value being a measurement of insulative properties, or how well does something insulate. So on a clear, still night, we can imagine the vast atmosphere outside of the greenhouse or high tunnel as being a sink for heat. All heat is radiating upwards and outwards, and the transmission of heat through that single layer of plastic can be so rapid that it actually drops below what is happening outside of that greenhouse. Now that's with a single layer.
Yeah.
And again, there's a lack of energy, or really of heat, as measured by infrared wavelengths in the soil, to replenish what the atmosphere is drawing from that single layer of plastic. So that's where we get into the negative R values. Now, I wrote that piece of 10 reasons not to grow in a high tunnel to be just a little bit provocative and have some fun. I've made a career of doing research in high tunnels and growing in them, so I recognize their benefits and am in favor of them, but they're not for everyone. And I was invited to give a talk at a general tomato school, and as being oftentimes thought of as the high tunnel guy, I didn't want to show up there and try to convince field tomato growers the high tunnels are ideal for them. So I gave them 10 reasons to think about, maybe this isn't ideal for you. And that is one of them, is that in the spring, you're putting yourself at risk as a grower if you don't add an additional layer of insulation or heat inside of that high tunnel on cold, still, frosty nights. So it's an easy problem to solve. You can put on a second layer of plastic and inflate that. So now you do have some insulation properties or some R value, or you can use low tunnels with floating row cover and gain some heat retention that way, or you can simply supplement heat. So it's an easy problem to solve, but it is something to pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, definitely worth pointing out, because I'm a huge fan of greenhouses and high tunnels and all the permutations of protected agriculture. But yeah, more than being a fan of them, I want people to make the right decision for their farm and not just say like everybody should go out and build a high tunnel. And so I thought it was interesting that you talked about that negative R value thing, because I've definitely talked to a few people over the years who put up high tunnels and were sort of like, I thought I was going to get a little bit more season extension out of it. And so that negative R value is an interesting phenomena that can be impacting that. And also just to realize you're still very much at the mercy of nature and the weather, especially in a high tunnel, where you don't have a heater. If it's a really cold spring, you might not get out there that much earlier than the field growers. On the other hand, once it gets warm, your plants are going to take off so much faster because of the greenhouse effect, obviously. But yeah, I mean, that's definitely everybody's got to know they're not going to be that much earlier than field growers if you don't have any heat, because we all know it could be really nice, and then you could have one freezing night that can damage the frost tender crops. And so there's only so much that an unheated house can do. And on the other hand, if people can build hoop houses and they can add a heater later, if it turns out not to be good enough, or like not enough season extension for their plans. So my main takeaway from your 10 reasons not to grow tomatoes in tunnels is basically that it's a higher level of an investment to grow in a tunnel. So the rewards can be greater, but so are the risks if that doesn't work out. So did I take away the correct message there? And is there anything else you want to say about 10 reasons not to grow in a high tunnel other than what we've already discussed?
No, I think you got it, Andrew. It is that a high tunnel requires additional management for all the things we talked about today, for example, with soils. And we didn't talk about pests and just managing the tunnel or the greenhouse itself. But it requires additional management. And if the grower is not up for that additional management, it might not be the right choice for them. But more than anything, I was having fun and trying to be a little bit thought-provoking with it.
Well, that's good. The devil needs their advocates too. The devil needs their advocates. I'm not sure. People know what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure exactly how to say that, but I love high tunnels, but it's good. Like everything in life, and especially agriculture, there's advantages and drawbacks to every solution. So
yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure you've been to farms where you see the high tunnel kind of neglected and the growers not paying a lot of attention to it. You come back a year or two later and there's a tractor parked inside that high tunnel and some equipment in there. And those are the people I would suggest maybe this isn't for you.
Yeah. I guess it's not right for everybody, but it can be a right tool. Like it can be a great tool in the right environment.
I
actually
agree. Yes.
It reminds me, you got to kind of prioritize it. It's funny looking at the materials that we've been talking about that you wrote. It made me think. I recently was talking to a grower, and part of their philosophy on high tunnel growing was they had this rule on their farm. They said, nobody touches broccoli until the high tunnel work is done. I guess one time he had been out, he noticed that the high tunnel work was falling behind, and like the workers were out in the field, and he was kind of like, what are you guys doing out here? And they're like, well, the broccoli needed some attention too. And he was like, it's basically like high tunnel first. It's like this the highest risk, highest payoff. And so that was the new rule. Don't touch broccoli until the high tunnel is taken care of. So that just made me think about that. All right. Well, Judson, that's really the questions that I had for you. I'm sure there's lots else we could talk about. We could talk about pests. We could talk about diseases, but we're not trying to do a 3-hour long podcast today. So maybe some other time. But is there anything else like along these lines that I should have asked you about, or anything you'd like to say before we let you go?
My points are pretty simple for people who are growing in soil-based greenhouses or high tunnels. 1, get a soil test. 2, get a water test. 3, take foliar tests. And number 4 is, if you can, grow a cover crop.
That all sounds like really good advice to me, Judson. All right. Well, thank you for that. So where can people find you online or social media or wherever you want people to look you up?
They can find me on Instagram and YouTube, and they're welcome to email me or text me or anything they want. Okay.
Great. Well, I really appreciate it because I know you're out there working with growers and help them try to be successful. So I really appreciate both the materials that you've put out there in the world and all the help that you give for growers. So thank you for that. And I hope you have a good rest of your season helping growers there. And
thank you. Thanks to you, Andrew, and thanks to Growing for Market podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. All right. It was fun. Thanks, Judson. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or a review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never even get billed. All subscriptions get you a year of the magazine, plus 150 downloadable back issues from the last 15 years and over 1,700 archived articles. With digital subscriptions starting at just $39 a year, head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers, for farmers, in Growing for Market magazine.